Government work for us, or do we work for the government? If the government derives its powers from us, the governed, how can it do what we can't do? Tonight, the government cooks the books. Yesterday, we learned that the government authorized the payment of $2.3 million under sharia law to the families of two young men who were killed by a CIA agent who shot them in the back. The agent was illegally in Pakistan. The federal government bribed Pakistanis to overlook the murders, and the foreign governments will do the same when one of their agents kills Americans. In America, the crime and the government's duty to prosecute the defendant does not go away just because the victim has been bribed to stay quiet. But your government authorized the payment of this bribe. Your government followed Sharia law, and your government made life a lot more dangerous for you on the streets in America, where we know that foreign spies operate every day. The same day the government breaks its own laws to let a killer off the hook, it also cooks the books to make itself look good. Yesterday, the federal government announced that 99% of Tarp funds that it advanced to banks when it bought preferred shares of stock in those banks has been repaid. Treasury Secretary Geithner even boasted that Tarp has been, quote, the most successful government assistance program in recent memory. Apparently, the 6 largest banks in the U.S. have now repaid their Tarp funds by buying back the stock that they sold to the government. But Secretary Geithner needs to have his memory refreshed, and here is where he has some memory failure. The money that the Treasury used to purchase hundreds of billions of dollars worth of bank stocks was borrowed by the Treasury. Those funds have not been repaid to the lenders, and the taxpayers are still paying interest on that. The Treasury essentially borrowed $700 billion and bought stock in the 60 largest American banks, many of which didn't even want to sell their stock to the government, but were forced to do so. Then the Treasury had the Federal Reserve print money and funnel that funny money to the same banks, which then bought their stocks back from the Treasury. This was a high-class, government-orchestrated shell game, and the government still owes the $700 billion it borrowed. The idea of Tarp itself was sold to the Congress by then-President George W. Bush and then Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson as a program by which failing mortgages and even some buildings and homes about to be foreclosed upon would be bought by the Treasury so as to retard or prevent a total collapse of the housing and credit markets. Remember that argument? In fact, no Tarp funds were directly used to purchase a single mortgage or mortgage security or a single building or home. If you or I went to a bank or to Congress and secured a loan or a grant with the promise to use the money in an agreed-upon way, and then we used the money in an entirely different way, we'd be prosecuted for fraud. But since the creators of the Tarp funds and the distributors of the Tarp funds and the people who decide whom to prosecute for fraud are essentially the same people, the bureaucrats in the Bush and Obama administrations, the government will not prosecute anyone, and it will continue to spend money in ways that Congress didn't authorize. That alone violates the Constitution, which says that only the Congress, not the President, not the Treasury Secretary, not some faceless bureaucrats, can determine how tax dollars or money borrowed in the taxpayers' names can be spent. Adding to all this is the cooking of the books of General Motors and other non-bank Tarp recipients. This was done so as to make losses disappear from the books by relieving GM and others of the income taxes that should have been imposed on them like they're imposed on the rest of us. GM was permitted to use $45 billion in pre-bankruptcy losses to offset its post-bankruptcy income. This is unheard of in modern times. Why did the Treasury Department permit this, even though it meant a vastly smaller tax bill to GM? Because the Treasury owns 79% of GM, and it thereby created the false impression that GM was profitable. Again, if you or I did this, we'd be prosecuted for fraud. America, the government is out of control. In 1 week, it bribed foreigners to overlook 2 murders. It followed Sharia law. It borrowed $45 billion. It lied about Tarp. And now, it wants to bomb Libya. And it expects all of us to accept all of that. All of this should remind us that the government recognizes no limits on its own ability to lie, to manipulate markets, and to violate the laws we have hired it to enforce, all in a vainglorious effort to make its projects appear fruitful, and its works appear just. Regrettably, they are neither. From New York, defending